Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to our first recorded feedback session for Working Lives in the Factories and Mills. We're going to cover some of the questions you asked in weeks 1 or 2, but not all of them because you've asked so many good questions. We're still catching up with them and we're really enjoying following along with your lively debates. So you've seen all of us in videos, but I'm particularly pleased that Fiona Davidson, who works for Historic Environment Scotland at Stanley Mills, has been able to come along today, so that we've got a proper museum expert to answer some of the things that you've asked.
No pressure.
I was especially pleased that Fiona could come because HES and Stanley have been involved in really interesting projects around race and slavery, and this is something we're delighted to see that you've all been asking about on the course because it's such a current and important issue. So I'm hoping that Fiona could tell us a little bit about what's been going on in the museum sector, because I know she's been speaking and participating in events around this.
Sure, I was taking part yesterday in the Northeast Colonialism conference, which is looking at transatlantic slavery links and colonial links within specifically the Northeast of Scotland, although we did stretch it a bit by including Stanley, which sits just 7 miles north of Perth. So the definition of Northeast Scotland was quite stretchable. But yeah, I think we've got a number of things on the go and we're at early stages, and it's an area that we haven't properly addressed, and it's important to recognise that we haven't properly addressed the links between colonialism, slavery and the historic environment. But there's initiatives happening at the moment that will go to address that. So we're part of the Managing Imperial Legacies project with Edinburgh University and CRER, to look at the impact of colonialism on the built environment. There's a conference taking place next year, hopefully, which will look at the research coming out of that project, and looking at how we communicate with communities that have links or whose histories should be represented in the stories that we're telling in those buildings. So it's very much like a networking project at the moment. And then added to that, we've just brought out equalities outcomes within the organisation, and we're hoping that will be the catalyst for us to go and revisit the interpretation at our sites to establish what histories have not been told so far. So in the case of Stanley, it's very much the links with the transatlantic slave trade. We had to admit a mea culpa moment yesterday because the interpretation on the site just does not mention enslavement at all. And yet we're talking about a 19th century cotton mill that was sourcing its cotton from the Americas and the Caribbean, that received huge investment in the 1820s from a Glasgow-based West Indies firm that allowed a massive expansion of the mills. So clearly their profits that were coming off the back of investments in sugar and cotton growing in the West Indies it benefited the mills, and allowed Stanley to keep running, as a profitable business. So we've got those on the go. We've just revisited our statement of cultural significance for Stanley, which sets out the reasons why we look after the property on behalf of the Scottish ministers. So drawing out the links between slavery and colonialism is a really important part of that because that had been overlooked. And then my colleague Mark Watson from the Industrial Heritage team, he's been conducting quite a lot of research into the links between the various owners at Stanley at different times with colonialism. And that includes people like David Dale and Robert Owen from New Lanark, who had ties to Stanley in terms of the management of the mill and providing advice and bankrolling, but also helping source cotton. So in the case of David Dale, he helped bankroll Stanley originally. He's also the first chair of the Glasgow Abolitionist Society, but he's also sourcing his cotton from plantations where enslaved people are growing it. So he seems to be able to balance out his kind of attitudes towards your moral and ethical issues at home, but still make a profitable business. So he has links with Stanley as well. So Mark's drawn out a lot of that research, and there's going to be a series of blogs on the Historic Environment Scotland website, which will explore 3 eras of the Mills management and what their links are with colonialism. So there's quite a lot of activity that's on the go at the moment.
There's loads of good stuff being done by museums and on our side in academia. So I think what we'll have to do next year is go through and refresh the whole course to make sure we've got all those new links and projects and information in, which will be exciting and interesting to do. And it's great that this is really being dealt with in the museum sector. It's so complicated. I mean, in our little sections on the cotton famine, we only scratch the surface of the debates that are going on about American slavery amongst the workers and amongst the management, but partly because it's very debated, you know, even amongst historians, there's not really a consensus about abolitionism amongst the cotton workers of the north of England. There are people arguing different sides, there are different perspectives, as you say, about the owners. There's a lot of ambiguity in people's moral stances over this. So it sounds like a cop-out to say it's all very complicated, but it's all very complicated. Was there anything you wanted to add on that, Mike?
Well, just 2 things really to draw out what Fiona's just said, which was really, really helpful, which is, of course, it's not just the raw material in terms of the cotton that is connected to the slave trade, but as Fiona's pointed out, a lot of the original investment capital that enables these buildings to be literally built is also drawn out from the slave trade, profits from the slave trade. So it's kind of doubly implicated in that way. And I suppose it might be worth mentioning as well that Robert Owen's son, Robert Dale Owen, is involved in the 1830s and 40s, I think, in a scheme in America with a kind of pioneering feminist, Frances Wright, where they tried to set up effectively a productive colony which will allow slaves to work their way to freedom. They're making a specific attempt that once the slave has produced value equal to their original purchase price, they will be set free. And Robert Dale Owen and Frances Wright offer this in the 1840s as a way of providing a longer term solution to the problem of chattel slavery in the American South. So that there are, contacts at the level of raw material, at the level of capital, but also at the level of individual activity as well, which I think makes for a really fascinating, and clearly there would be another MOOC course that could just basically focus on these issues alone.
Yeah, and especially when you start thinking about the textile trade's investments in South America, Sir Titus Salt and where his raw materials are coming from, and the jute trade in Dundee and its links to India. Continuing links to India and Dundee, where people managing jute factories today will come over to Verdant Works and say, the manager was telling me, this is exactly the same machine that we still have running in our mills. So yeah, maybe we should do another whole course on that.
And I think as well as the raw material coming in, there's also the products that are going out. So whether Stanley was producing sailcloth, well, that sailcloth is being sold to a particular industry and sector that's then sailing across the Atlantic. Cloth for clothes is clearly being produced, and that's being sold to plantations to clothe enslaved workers. So you've kind of got the two ends of it coming in, and it'd be interesting to know how aware the workers were of the situation in the Americas, particularly when you get to the 1860s, because you have former enslaved people coming across to Scotland and giving public talks. There's one in 1862 recorded in Perth, attended by a respectable audience apparently. But there's still a correlation made at the time between the audience of the circumstances of industrial workers in Britain and almost likening it to the circumstances of enslaved people in America. And the two are not in any way the same, but it's interesting that that's the mindset of some people at the time.
It was a common comparison, whereas now it seems to us an unreasonable comparison on a wide variety of grounds. Then it was a fairly standard analogy that's used again and again, but often in broader senses, because part of this, I was just answering a learner's question to this end, is part of this is just about the way that terms have changed their meaning over the period and come to be more specific than they were in the looser context they were used in our period. Yeah. And there was another question, an interesting question about diversity in the mills, which is not so much about race, but also about religion. So we know there were Catholic workers in a lot of these mills because they were Irish immigrants or workers in the Highlands. But diversity in the workforce in general, Fiona, is this something that we know about or that we can explore?
I would imagine that Stanley is less diverse than other mills, certainly compared to like the West Coast Glasgow mills, who would have received a lot of Irish influx of workers, whereas Stanley's workers seems to have been sourced from the local area and the Highlands. Perthshire and Perth itself was well established as a textile town, so there was a lot of expertise to draw on. And originally the first workers are come from the Cleared Highland estates in North Perthshire that were owned by the Duke of Atholl. I'm assuming that some of those workers would follow Catholicism, but other than that, there's very little diversity amongst the workforce that we can tell. And looking at census records from like the village, there's very little influx from out with Scotland. When you get to the 1851 census, and obviously they record a place of birth or where you were from, there's very little diversity. It's mostly Perthshire and Scotland. So, and I guess by looking at the establishment of churches in the area, it might give you an idea of like the religions, but it seems to be predominantly Presbyterian and United Free Church.
Yeah, interesting to think that the Highland workers would have been speaking Gaelic. I'm just reminded that you have that lovely Gaelic poem, don't you, in Stanley on one of the top floors?
Yeah, we do, and I guess that would be the kind of like the early, like a clash of cultures, because you had lowland workers coming in, or textile specialists from Perth, and then workers from the Highlands who brought their own culture with them, and Gaelic speaking. So you can imagine there would be a diversity in language, certainly, and culture. Interesting that there was a singing club established in the village in the 1830s. It'd be nice to imagine that there was Gaelic song and a sharing of cultures as part of that, but that's something that requires a bit of research, I think.
Could I just say on that south of the border, the situation is slightly complicated because of the presence of so many other Protestant nonconformist denominations. So certainly there's an influx of Irish labour into Manchester and some of the other major cities. But of course, in a lot of the Lancashire and West Riding towns, the official, as it were, state religion, the Anglican Church, is not often followed by either workers or owners and managers. Certainly in Lancashire, Unitarians seem to have played a fairly prominent role in mill ownership. The Greggs at Quarrybank Mill are a kind of prime example there, with workers tending to go to either one of the Methodist denominations or sometimes one of the Baptist denominations. So there's a kind of interesting religious diversity south of the border, even if there isn't always a kind of national diversity.
Yeah. And there was a question about whether mills set up their own churches, which is there's not usually a church or a chapel as part of the mill buildings, but the owners and the managers would have effectively sponsored local places of worship by supporting them and helping to fund them and showing up every Sunday and being involved in their activities. And of course, to go to the same place of worship as your boss was potentially a workplace advantage as well. So religion is certainly woven into the texture of everything that happens here. And when you look at the comments, one of the things that always comes up in running Victorian courses is that we tend to forget that Victorian Britain is really a Christian fundamentalist state, and that this factors into a lot of attitudes about colonialism and imperialism and paternalism and your status in life and whether it's predestined by God and you should be happy in your chosen position and so forth, in ways that just aren't as evident to us today, or that now seem hypocritical, but at the time seemed completely standard.
Certainly the main church at Stanley was set up by the company, and it was a huge amount of money at the time, like tens of thousands to build it. So there was an expectation that workers would be seen at the church on a Sunday, and I'm sure it would be noted if they weren't at the church on a Sunday.
Presbyterian, Fiona?
Yeah, I think it was Church of Scotland, or what would become Church of Scotland. Although interestingly, the manager later on in the 1870s, who became the owner, was a Chartist, I think. I think Frank Stuart Sandeman was a Chartist. So
we had quite a few questions about life on the factory floor. Some were about health and safety. So a lot of interest in the noise. Questions about, would you have protected your hearing? Workplace noise legislation doesn't come in until after the mid-20th century. Do we know, Fiona, whether workers created their own earplugs, earmuffs?
I would struggle to find any information or evidence that would confirm that, but it's hard to see how, if you were a worker, you wouldn't attempt to try and minimize the impact on your hearing, especially if you're working with cotton. You've got a ready-made material that you could pop in your ears to try and minimize it, although that obviously meant that you were blocking out other noises that you might want to be aware of, whether it was the overseer or any other element of a typical working day. But as Kirstie said, the legislation comes in so late, and even then I think factories got away with it if they could. So in the 1960s at Stanley, there's still workers working without any ear defenders, and we're lucky enough to still have former workers living in and around the village today who can testify to that, whether it's themselves or members of their family, parents who worked there, who didn't have ear defenders and subsequently suffered significant hearing loss and hearing damage. So if that's the case in the 1960s, I would imagine it was certainly the case before that.
Yeah, and I think the total disregard for health and safety sometimes comes as a surprise to our learners. We had a few questions about lighting as well, where I think it's hard to believe that these factories full of extremely flammable material were lit by candles and then gas, but that is the case, isn't it?
Yeah. Candles or oil lamps initially would have been the standard form of light at most mills, and that's why you have a significant number that suffer damage by fire, whether it's entire mills being destroyed by fire in that late 18th, early 19th century period. So Stanley's second mill that was built, the East Mill, was entirely burnt to the ground. So mill owners, factory builders knew the risks, but they have the fuel at their disposal that's at their disposal. And until gas comes along, they would maybe try and mitigate some of the risks. So we know at Stanley that it's got a really, really early example of a sprinkler system installed. So they're recognising that fire risk is significant, and obviously clearing up cotton was an essential part of workers' duties, whether it was young children or adults, again to try and minimise the amount of flammable material that was in the mill floors. So in the 1820s, when the Buchanan Company take over Stanley Mills, the first thing they build is a gasworks, and that lights the mills for decades. Until the mill transfers over to electricity. So we've still got the remains of the chimney, which was originally 100 feet high, and the foundations of the gasometer that sit in the middle of the site, and that would allow the mills to work through the night in the winter.
Yeah, long hours again. People are often surprised by just how long they could be, but they really were. And we had a few interesting questions about the clothing products. Did mill workers themselves wear or buy the cotton that they produced? what happened to the inferior goods, where they used, where they recycled, where they sold. Do you know the answers? Oh, and a question about the different quality of factory produced cloth versus handloom weaving, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, that last one's really intriguing. It's not something that we've explored, and it'd be good to find out what the difference is, because obviously your factory production is designed for speed and volume rather than your quality, but how it measures up against like a handmade piece of cloth, it would be a really interesting comparison. At Stanley, I know that we've got a ledger that dates from the 1870s and one that's even earlier. And there's entries that seem to indicate the sale of cotton flock, which is the waste material. And they were selling that to bring in some additional income. And they did have quite a large opening machine at the mill, which was repurposed to recycle inferior quality cotton. So it would break it up, tear it up, so it would take it back to as near its original state as possible, and could then get repurposed for something else. So that sort of thing was happening, because I guess you're trying to make as much profit as you can out of what you're producing. So if it's a sale of waste material, or if it's recycling to then produce other goods that have a value, then businessmen, I'm sure, would be aware of that and keen to take advantage of it. In terms of the workers buying the material, I guess it depends what the mills are producing, because Stanley survived because it spotted gaps in the market and tended to go for niche products. So certainly in the latter stages, it's making less high quality, finer cotton cloth that would be used for clothing, and more industrial type products. So whether it was sailcloth early on, or backings for carpets, or brake linings, or belting to drive machinery. So there's perhaps less evidence for workers buying the product because it wasn't that kind of product.
Yeah, I mean, someone was again asking about, we think about clothing, but of course textiles have so many different uses. There's an amazing poem we have in our project actually, just called Jute, that's talking about how when you just look around your house in Dundee, everything you're looking at has got in it, the sofa cushions and the stuffing and your hats and the carpets and it's everywhere. But I guess workers usually cheap printed cotton. Workers could have afforded to buy that.
Yeah. Cotton had come down in price and was cheap and affordable. That's why it was being produced in such volume. So where they were sourcing it, we can't say for certain. There was a shop in the village. They might have been able to buy it direct from the factory. Interestingly enough, some of our former workers from the 20th century say that they remember going down to the mills to buy material and fabric. I've still to kind of drill down into that a bit further to find out exactly, is it a leased part of the building that they were buying. I think it's sheeting and think maybe bed linen. So whether that's being produced at the mills or somebody's leased a part of the building and was selling it, but it maybe hints at a kind of history that came before it.
Now, what were the other things we had about the mill floor? There was a question I was interested in from week one, or a discussion about what Andrew you said about. So there were a couple of questions about age and about disability, actually. Mike, I think you want to say something about age and retirement or lack of. I was just going to say in relation to disability, there was a little debate in the comments at one point about how able-bodied you needed to be to work. And it's because Andrew Ure says, well, these jobs are good because actually people who couldn't do manual labour in agriculture can do it in the factory. Actually, there is quite a lot of evidence that disabled workers could do factory jobs. For instance, if you had a serious leg injury, or there are a lot of people who are former soldiers, they've lost a limb, but you're still able to work a machine in the way that obviously you might not be able to work a hand loom. Because when the job moves towards minding machines rather than a kind of whole body operation of something, it does become easier for people with certain kinds of disability to do, let's say. And I think that's actually a really interesting aspect of factory employment. It renders you disabled due to the number of workplace accidents, but it is a job in which when you walk onto the factory floor, you're not looking at a sort of entirely healthy, fit, able-bodied workforce. I mean, that's true of really any Victorian factory floor, given the state of health. And Mike, do you want to say anything about becoming old and
something about becoming old, but also to follow on from that question of disability and kind of occupational injury, because someone raised the question about whether or not these were monitored, and largely in the early part of the 19th century, no, they're not. There's no official body that you need to report these things to. There's no real inspectorate set up. But often campaigners for factory reform would collate statistics, would collate examples of injury and harm. And there's also a very important figure in Leeds, a surgeon called Charles Thackeray, who died in 1833, but he produces the first study of what we would now call occupational health, where he actually records the kinds of illnesses and injuries that are associated with the various forms of employment that he's come into contact with. So he's a really interesting figure who sets the groundwork for occupational health. In terms of older workers, we're really looking at a period where you work until you drop. That's pretty much how it goes, and a very kind of sad but illustrative tale is from where I used to live in the West Riding of Yorkshire, which was a big textile area, and I lived quite close to Hebden Bridge. And in the latter half of the 19th century, Hebden Bridge set up a large cooperative factory producing fustian, which was kind of the fabric that workers wore quite frequently for clothing. And the origins of that, the guy who founded that factory tells the story that he was working in a workshop, and there was an older worker in his early 60s, and it was the practice that when you finished weaving your piece, you had to carry it from the loom effectively to the warehouse for storage. And it was too much for this older worker to carry, so they had an informal arrangement on the shop floor that the younger would take it in turns to carry his finished product to the warehouse. And on this day, an argument broke out about whose turn it was, and the older worker himself basically picked up the cloth, walked it to the warehouse, came back and dropped dead. And at that point, Joseph Greenwood, who went on to found the cooperative mill, thought there's got to be more to life than this. We've got to do something where we don't simply work till we drop. So, essentially, you worked until you dropped, because old age pensions don't really come in until the 20th century. So you've got no real choice, as we've commented on a number of occasions on this course. It really is work or starve for much of the 19th century.
Yeah. I mean, if you're lucky enough, you've got a family who will take you in your old age, and they're all working in the mill, and they'll look after you, and you'll look after all the smaller children who are too young to work. But yeah, if you don't have that, then you are in trouble. I'm going to skip over a few questions and we'll answer them in the comments, just because I can see that we could all talk about this for 3 hours. You want to watch that. Let me skip on to a couple of questions about big projects. So Fiona, a few people who've got relatives in the industry have been asking about records of mill workers and whether those survive.
Yep.
By the mills as opposed to in the census records.
I mean, there's some mills who will have extensive archival records. Stanley isn't one of them, unfortunately. Our records are business records and the majority is from the latter 19th century and into the 20th century, and they're held in Dundee. I think the earliest documentary evidence we've got that's like primary documentary evidence is a ledger from the 1790s. And there's obviously glimpses. Some of the workers are listed, particularly in the ledger from the 1870s, which is the Frank Stuart Sandeman era. There's names listed, but other than that, our records are pretty sparse, and the best route is to go through the census records where occupation is listed. And if you're living in Stanley Village and you're listing your occupation as a spinner or a weaver or a textile worker, then the chances are you're working at the mill. So, but it's pretty patchy for Stanley, which is really unfortunate, because we know that there's a real interest from visitors who come actually to the visitor centre. And we've had visitors from Manchester, from Australia, from everywhere, with a name and asking if we have any records of somebody with that name working at the mill, and we simply don't. It's a big gap, unfortunately, but not a lot we can do about it. It's kind of screaming out for a big research project.
But then the research project would have to be done via the census, because I think what you're saying is replicated by most mills. I've never seen records about the workers. They're all business level records in which workers are incidental. And what you were just saying about people coming from all over, there's another interesting question about whether there's any large scale work done on mobility. Another thing that's come up in the comments a lot, the way that workers moved around or didn't move around, stayed in the small mill town in several generations work. But again, to do such a project would be so difficult and global and large scale, and how you would do it other than pouring through individual census records in multiple countries. I don't know, nothing like that does exist, does it?
And even then, when you're looking at a 10-year gap between census records, when you think about what would happen in your own life in a 10-year period, you might have moved away and returned within that 10-year period. So the census isn't going to pick up on that kind of interim migration. Maybe if you'd went off to work for 5 years but then returned, it's going to look like you've never left. So it's an interesting one to try and track. And I guess unlike agricultural labour, where I think there was much more like movement, where you would move between farms to pick up work and move across county boundaries, I reckon textile mills maybe offer that bit more security in terms of, you could, if we're talking about work until you drop, you could argue it's a job for life if you manage to get in, unless your mill closes down or goes through a period of loss of profit, and then you're left looking to find work elsewhere. So that's what happens in the 1860s, where the owner, Samuel Howard, at the time, buys the mills. The American Civil War happens, and rather than process the cotton, he decides to speculate in the cotton to sell to Manchester at an inflated price, and he closes the mills. So he makes hundreds of people reliant on that source of income unemployed. And John Campbell's poem points to the fact that you've got people from Stanley having to head to Dundee or Glasgow to try and find employment, because it's a seismic shift for a village that size, where the mill is the main employer.
Well, sometimes mobility is voluntary and sometimes it's involuntary. I mean, what surprises me sometimes when Mike and I are tracing mill worker writers is how often people moved in and out of the mills. You would go off and do something else for 20 years, and then there you are back at the end of your life, doing the same job. So it's funny, sometimes it's a job for life and sometimes you drop in and out. And we had quite a lot of discussion about upward mobility and the kind of the extent to which social mobility was possible in the Victorian period in week one. So there are a lot of stories, especially from the early part of the century, where you start as a little piecer or an errand boy when you're 6 or 8 years old, and you're a bright young thing and you get noticed by management and you work your way up, or you look at the machinery and you've got a technical mind and you can see an improvement that at this early stage helps you to build a career. But I think that does become less common as the century progresses. where by the end of the century, you're more fixed in your status as an employee, and professional qualifications for people who are middle engineers and so forth are starting to come in. So it's not just turn your hand to whatever you're gifted at anymore.
Do you think there was a ceiling as well, where you might well start off as a piecer, but there was a limit to how high you could go? So you might make it as far as overseer, but would you go beyond that, because is that getting beyond your status? And clerks in the office are a very different type of worker. Is it possible to start off as a piecer and end up as a clerk, or working with the finance or on the business side of the mill, or is that completely cut off to you if you've come through the factory floor?
Well, I mean, Mike and I would say to that, and Mike, just shout if you want to come in, Mike, that the way to get yourself from being the piecer or whatever to the clerk is to write poems. And you write poems, you join the church, so the manager sees you sitting there in the pew every day. You join the Sunday school, you become a Sunday school teacher. You join the debating society and the mutual improvement group, and you set up a local library and you put yourself in the committee. And, Sir Titus or whoever is seeing all this approvingly. And next thing you know, he's saying to the person below him, seems like a bright young man, I like this wonderful poem he wrote about how amazing I am. Can we stick him in the counting house? And that actually did happen. So there were informal routes outside the very limited education that you got in middle schools. If you were smart enough and determined enough and actually would put in the time to get yourself noticed and to get yourself into desk-based jobs. But it wasn't usual. These were, no. We find these individuals because they're the exceptions, not the rule. Isn't that right, Mike?
I think that's right. And also, I suspect as well that the longer you go on into the 19th century, the more difficult it gets to break through that kind of ceiling that Fiona was describing, because the startup capital increases. So in the sort of early part of the 19th century, if you can get the money together to rent a room and to get a couple of either spinning jennies or a couple of power looms, you've got a chance of starting your own business. By the time you get past 1850, 1860, the amount of capital required to start new enterprises is huge. You can't accumulate that through careful savings of your wages. But the other thing I would note as well is, of course, from the 1840s onwards, the idea of the self-made man, the idea of the worker who rises from the shop floor, becomes increasingly important in the kinds of myths that the textile industry tells about itself. So those kinds of stories of the self-made man become more and more important, even as the kind of practical examples of the self-made man dwindle in historical reality.
And this is also where the fantasy of the boss, who's so heavily involved in the lives of the workers and is walking the factory floor saying hello to them, comes into play, because that again becomes more and more distanced as the century progresses. People were asking about this, so yes, you do have mill owners who live in the same place as the workers, like Robert Owen's house at New Lanark is a great example, and who do know them and who do interact with them, and who in some cases were one of them before becoming the boss. But increasingly, I don't think that's the case by the end of the century. Though, that is really the rationale for us having a whole week on this course and not on the other working lives courses on the owners, is that there's that intertwining, there's that sense that the owner, even if you don't, because they're off in London throwing parties in their townhouse for 11 months of the year, there's still this perception that there's a closer relationship between the worker on the mill floor and the owner of the mill. And do you think that's true of Sandeman and the other owners, Fiona and Stanley, that kind of paternalistic?
I think for the Buchanan company, there's definitely that paternalistic streak that goes right the way through Stanley's history. The Buchanan's is quite an overbearing one, to the point where it's controlling the lives of the workers. But by the time you get to Sandeman's era in the 1870s, he's hosting spelling bees to raise money for the local library, and he seems to be invested in village life in a really supportive way, as opposed to a controlling way. So there's a lot of fundraising going on, or he's lending his name to things to help things along. So I think there's a poem written in his his honour, but extolling his virtues. But he seems to have been much more part of the community. The owners at Stanley did live along from the mill in the big house. I think one of them burnt down at one point, and then another one was built further along the peninsula. So yeah, I think that they would be in and around the community, so they would have been physically seen by workers, and then possibly a level of interaction with them as well, so through village life.
Yeah.
I think geographical location is important here, isn't it? That if you're talking about a mill that's situated rurally, that's a kind of village mill, you often, Quarrybank Mill in Cheshire is a good example of this as well. The Greggs Mill that we've looked at as well, where the house is literally next door to the mill. But if you've got the money, there's no way you're building a big house next to a mill if your mill is situated in the middle of Manchester or the middle of Glasgow. You're building it out in the countryside somewhere, aren't you?
Yeah, in the posh suburbs.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So it does vary greatly. There's such a difference between the local village mills and the city mills, as I think, again, a lot of commenters have sort of noted and highlighted. I feel like we better draw to a close since we've been a lot to chat about. Mike says he promised I would talk about McGonagall, but I'll just say, yes, I am a world expert on McGonagall and on bad poetry of the Victorian period. So is Mike. So anything you want to know, just drop us a line. I'm sure we can share our many publications on this topic. Isn't that true, Mike?
Just to add a little something to that, Kirstie is the expert on this. And the point about McGonagall that she makes is that it is deliberately bad, and it's understood by his readers to be deliberately bad, that's part of the competition here. So in a sense, for a while, we've been misreading McGonagall and thinking, God, this is terrible. How did people ever appreciate that? The point was that you appreciated it precisely because it was rubbish, precisely because he broke all the rules and did so knowingly. So if you're interested in pursuing that, what Kirstie's published on McGonagall is well worth a read. There is one last bit of advertising we want to do as well, which is connected with Stanley Mills, connected with the Piston Pen and Press course, is an event featuring Kirstie and two of the singer-songwriters that we're working with on the Piston Pen and Press project. Findlay Napier and Gillian Frame are doing an event, and I'll leave it to Kirstie and possibly Fiona to say where that event is and how you get the tickets.
Yeah, so we posted a link already at the end of week 1. I'll post another one, but Tuesday, 8 p.m, just an hour long, hosted on Zoom. Everybody's welcome. Feel free to advertise, and we do hope to see some course participants there. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.